Hello and welcome to another little video. In this video, I'm quickly gonna talk a little bit about the potentiometers that you find in your guitar so that you can make an educated guess on what you need in your guitar. And if you're building something, these are, important electrical components, but there is some miscommunication, I feel, online about them. So let's just jump into it. Here I have two potentiometers, big one and a small one. Now the first thing you need to understand is that a pot in your guitar is basically just a variable resistor. And a resistor is this tiny little electrical component. Here it is. If you're able to see it, that means you have great eyesight. That's how tiny it is. Here's my nail on my thumb, and I have very big nails, but look, in comparison, super tiny. And on a modern circuit board, it would be even smaller. A variable resistor basically just means that you have a max value, but you can change it. You can basically think of it as the water coming out of your sink, and depending on how much you crank it, the more water comes out. What value you should have in your guitar depends on what kind of pickup you have. It also depends on if it's a darker pickup sounding wise, and also if it's brighter. There are, for example, a lot of people that think that you should have 500k for a humbucker and a 250k for single coil pickup. But it's also a question of your taste, but it's also a question of if the pickup is bright or dark. Some humbuckers are darker than other humbuckers, and some are brighter than others. So really, it's a question of taste, but also the pickups. And there is no real exact give or take here. The best thing to do is actually to try things out and find out what you like. But as a rule, to sort of guideline you would have something like 500k for a humbucker and 250 for a single coil. And that is because if you put something like 500 on a single coil, you will let more through and it will be more bright than it is. So you want to take something really bright and darken it up a little bit. But that's not necessarily true. Something like a Jaguar, a Fender Jaguar, has a Meg for their pots and they are single coil. So you might actually want to create something really cool and bright with a Strat with 1 meg pots in it, for example, or 500Ks. Now another thing that is very important that you'll hear a lot is people saying bigger pots are better or bigger pots feel better. And that is a subjective thing and it comes down to your preference. But when it comes to if they are better, they are not. That has to do with quality. And quality has more to do with what brand they are and how they're made. It also has to do with their percent tolerance of the pot, because if you read on the back, it usually says a number. On this one, it says 250k, but you can measure it with your multimeter. And they are never exact, or at least most of the time they're not exact, they're somewhere close. So for example, this one that I'm holding here that I took out of the guitar, it is 237 when I measured it. And that's close to 250, but it's not really. And so, there is a percentage within the pots. That's a part of the quality. Another one is build quality. How long will it last? How much, use and abuse can it take? And you're gonna have to try out different brands and try to see what is best. There are brands that are being recommended on YouTube as being good quality ones, and for most part I would say that you can trust them, because usually having a good pot and working on your brand name is important. But that doesn't mean that, if you buy a inexpensive beginner guitar and you get these smaller pots, they are naturally bad. If they're brandless, most likely they're brandless because the person who makes them doesn't really want to take responsibility for, lesser quality. While if you see that they have a nice brand on them, doesn't mean that they have to be good, but it most likely mean that at least it's made by someone who wants to take the responsibility of their product. It's the same thing with guitars. Sometimes you find, good or bad guitars, but usually the brand name, it doesn't mean that it's quality. It just means that the person, they're proud of their name and they don't want to soil it with a bunch of bad guitars. So hopefully, at least, they are trying to do the right thing and fix bad guitars and help out. Obviously, sometimes that's sadly not the case. Now, another part that is important about the size thing is when someone says they like the way it feels. And what that comes down to is, if you think of something like, for example, a racetrack with, sprinters running, the track looks something like this. And as you can see here from my crude drawing, it's further. So from here to here, the distance is shorter than from here to here. Now, if you know anything about track, you know that they start in an angle like this. So this person stands further out than this person. And that's because they've measured the distance to the goal to make sure that they don't have to run as far. And the same thing actually goes for your pot. Not the measured out the distance, but that there actually is a further distance. So, for example, if we pretend that this is your pot, sort of seen through, the distance from here to here is smaller than the distance from here to here. And so when you move a small pot, going from something like 3 to 12 o'clock, will go really quickly. It's a small movement. But on one of these bigger pots, it's actually more of a movement. And so you can dial it in. Finding the space in between these two spots right here is more difficult than finding the spot in between these two spots right there. But that doesn't mean that they are better or worse, or that there is some sort of different in quality. Obviously, if you're making a bigger pot, you might be thinking more about guitars and electronical builds or something like that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are that. There are brandless, quickly made, pots that are big, that are poor quality, has low values, and are made of like cheap materials. And yes, you can buy them and they're bigger, but it doesn't mean that they're better. So when it comes to choosing what kind of size you should have, it's a question of what you like. Do you want to be able to find the spot in between maybe, one or two, for example? For some players that is super important, but for some people they never even use the controls on their guitar more than like once a year, and it's a question of going from max to 0. And I mean, in those cases I would probably even say that maybe having some sort of like switch is better than having a potentiometer, because why roll off the volume when you could just turn it off? But anyway, that's a totally different discussion. So it really comes down to what kind of player are you? Do you want to be the kind of player who is messing around with the tone control and the volume control and is always trying to find the sweet spot, or that is changing while playing? That can be really interesting. Like if you play the chorus of a song and you have the tone knob completely closed, so it's really dark and muddy, and then as the chorus comes you roll it off so it becomes brighter. It feels like the song is being lifted. It's really interesting to use, but not everyone is like that. Some people just want to go from 1 to 10 on their controls. And I would say if that's you, a smaller pot might actually be exactly what you need. So don't knock it just because someone else on YouTube is saying you need to have big pots. No, you don't need to have big pots. If you look at, for example, guitar pedals, they rarely come with big pots. They usually come with small pots. And I don't see anyone complaining about that and saying stuff like, all pedals are bad because they don't come with big pots. And if you're going to use pedals, you need to switch out the pots. I have never heard that. I've never seen anyone have that discussion. So it's weird that that's the case when it comes to guitars. If it's important to you to be able to really control the volume and the tone knob, change them out. Do it. It's a perfectly good way of finding the perfect thing for you. Another thing you could do is switch out one of them. You don't need to have the same size on all your pots. You can have a really tiny pot for your tone and a really big pot for your volume. And there are actually even bigger pots than these. They're rarely used in guitars, but you could go for that. You could even do crazy stuff like double pots, like the one I'm holding right here. It's a little bit out of frame and there's a bunch of cables attached to it to do weird control things, you know, that way too. There is also something called trim pots, which you can see here. It's a really, really tiny little pot, and they can actually be even smaller than that. For example, I doubt that you're going to be able to see this, but that tiny silver circle right there that I'm pointing with the screwdriver because my finger is too big, that is also a trim pot. And you can put in trim pots in your guitar if you want to, actually. And there are trim pots that have spaces for a tiny little handle, and you could, you know, make it bigger and fix it to the guitar so that you would have a knob possibility to put on it of some sort. You would probably have to like sculpt it out of like super clay of some sort, but it's possible to do. And then you would have a, you know, for example, maybe a tone control that is really hard to dial in. But just because it's hard to dial in doesn't mean, you know, that it's bad, because I would say that a lot of people would need a dial-in tone knob that is bad. Not bad quality, but like it's hard to do it because it's like I want to be able to move it from 1 to 10 really quick. And I don't want to switch it out, for example, a switch, because I like the look of having, you know, a volume and a tone, and I don't want to have a tone switch. Which you could obviously do, it's absolutely no problems. Anyway, I hope this little video helped. If you have any questions, talk to me in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. If you like the video, don't forget to press the like button and the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed, because that would make me. But anyway, until next time, stay awesome and cool, and go and experiment with changing out pots, both the value of them but also the size of them. And, you know, you might be pleasantly surprised to realize that something that you thought was bad or that was wrong is actually pretty cool. And there's a lot of fun things you can do with that. So, do it now, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye, bye-bye.